Okay. It worked this time, but sometimes this machine and I are not quite in tune with one another. So bear with it, please. I'm going to start off tonight, first of all, with a poem that I wrote about 10 years ago, looking back at the war. And I'm going to end the talk with 3 poems that I wrote when I was 17 in 1946, at the end of the war, to give you a feel for the difference between the 2 moments in my life. And this particular poem is going to provide you with a little bit of information about people you're now going to see in the pictures that I show you about the war. And it's called From Streets Unlit. I come from morning skies that look like sunsets and nights of screeching shells and bombs. I come from streets unlit, unnamed, and windows hidden behind curtains, double-lined. I come from "Take that damn dog away!" shouted by my uncle in the dark from mattress on the floor, as gunfire sends Timbo on the trembling to his side for safety. I come from meat ration, saved specially for guests, fresh liver chopped, spread lavishly on crackers, and crackers all askew, licked bare with Vicky guilty on the floor beside them. I come from Europe on a wall map, filled with paper flags on pins, British, Russian, and American, German and Italian, creating scarves of color on our wall. I am commander of the flags. Each day, I change their patterns according to the news, as though by moving pins, I can control the outcome of the war. And I mention this particularly because what I'm going to tell you about is an experience of war over which I do not have any control. And therefore, it's a very different kind of a pattern than even those who are fighting in the war, in the army, the navy, or the air force, or any other form of the fighting, felt that they had an agency. But those of us who were the civilians did not feel that agency very much. To some extent, my father was in the fire service. He was enrolled at night to help defend St. Paul's Cathedral. My brother was a messenger in the group of people who were messengers for the air raid wardens. And to that extent, you had some agency, really, but it was very little compared to what was needed. And you were very much at the mercy of whatever happened. So here we are at the beginning of the war, and I put this up particularly to remind Americans that the war started in Europe 2 years before America entered the war. So for us, it was a 6-year war. I'm not going to spend very much time on the middle part because I want particularly to focus on the 2 periods that had greatest impact for me, 1939 to 41, and then again from 1944, particularly with the development of the Second Front in June 1944 to the end of the war. The questions I'm going to discuss are, what direct effects of the war did I experience? And in what ways did my being Jewish impact my life during the war and before the war? And how did my ideas about war and peace change between 1939 and 45? And in what ways did the nature of war itself change during World War II? Now, wars seem to have a sort of way of being thought about when they occur that one can really harks back to the war before the last. And therefore, what one expects in the war, when one starts a war, is it's going to be like what war was like before. And the fallacy of that is that, of course, it isn't the same way. So some of you may have seen War Horse. Did anybody see either the film of War Horse or the play? Okay. So can somebody just tell me, what was War Horse about? Call out. It was about World War I. What else was it about? About a horse, yes, and? All right, well, what War Horse was about the way horses were made redundant by the end of the war, because what took over was the tank. And once there were tanks, humans didn't any longer have any need for the care of the horses that they had previously, which they had to ride in order to have any movement forward. And what happened at the end of World War I was that the horse was no longer the necessary part of fighting battles for human beings. It was tanks that were used instead. And so you end World War I with a realization that there's a mechanization going on. But when it comes to World War II, there are still people who are thinking in terms of what it was like with World War I. And they were thinking that, well, okay, now we're going to have to deal with tanks. But there were other things that were going on in the period before the war, before the Second World War, and one of it was the war in Spain. Can anybody tell me what was particularly new at the time of the war in Spain? Somebody here knows.
That's great.
Bombing of civilians.
Bombing, okay, good. I knew that was going to happen. They're going to tell me that there. So there was bombing that went on in Spain and the Spanish War, because by the time it came to that war, there were now airplanes that could be used for bombing. Bombing has a huge effect on changing the nature of war, because it means that the civilian population gets involved in war in a very different way than it was before. And have to bear that in mind, that when we started off with World War II, we were still thinking in many ways, though it was going to be like what had gone before. It wasn't. It was something different. Okay, now to my family. My mother, my brother, and me in early 1939, we're sitting in Mill Hill in London. We've just got a new house there. We moved. I think this must have been taken early 39 or maybe in 38, because my size against my brother, who's 5 years older than me, looks very great. And I think by the time it came to the end of 1939, I was a little bit taller. But there's me, my brother Ronnie, my mother, Nellie Jacobs, who was Nellie Watchman when she was single, and Timbo. You heard about Timbo in the poem that I read just before. He's the dog who we had. This is our car. This was a Wolseley. Did you have Wolsleys in America? No. All right. What I like about it is that the windshield opens, so you get plenty of air. You notice that, this here is a horn. And there's only one headlight there, but there were headlights down lower. And of course, it had a gear shift, you know, the way they had it those days. I learned to drive on that car. It's grey with a blue streak on it. That's me there, and that's our house. So that's the group in Mill Hill. This is my father sitting in the garden with Timbo. Timbo, by that time, was about 12. He had a very nice white patch on him here. He was a very, very good dog. He allowed me to put him with a bonnet on his head in my doll's carriage, and I wheeled him round the garden at one time. So that's my immediate family. But my mother was one of 10 children. 5 boys and 5 girls. And I'm trying to show you, we would be at the beach in the 1930s. We always went to the same place. It was Worthing. I don't know if any of you know England and Worthing, the south coast. Yes, you do? Good. And we would be, all of us there. So there would be my mother, her sister Rachel, who was next in line, then Frida, then Ray, and then Dorothy, who was rather much younger because there were 2 boys between them. So I just want to tell you that's me, and that's my brother Ronnie. And this gentleman is going to marry this woman, and he went into the army at the beginning of the war. This gentleman, John, was my uncle who fought at the Battle of El Alamein and went then to Palestine to be in the army. And my aunt, at that time, this gentleman, Leslie, he also was in the army. Alfred was the one member of the family, quite young, who stayed to run the business. The business at the time was making shoes, and shoes were terribly important at that time, both for the army and for the general public. So that was an important component of the war effort. So my mother's parents had come to England in 1900 from Warsaw, and they were Jewish. And my grandfather became a shoemaker in London. He was very active in the same synagogue as my father's father. That's how the families met. And in 1939, my grandfather, my mother's father, had at least one sister and her family still living in Warsaw, Poland. He never heard from them again after the Germans invaded Poland, and the family never spoke about them after the war. So I think that they were killed. My father's family was different. They came from Germany originally, and my father was the youngest of 6 boys and 1 girl. His grandfather had moved to London to start a leather business, and in 1939 family members were active in the Orthodox Jewish community. They still had first cousins living in Germany, and one family of first cousins sent their 2 sons to England during the war, and again they were killed in concentration camps. The parents were. So the family was on vacation as the war begins, and we were in that same place, Worthing, going to be there. And fearing the gas attack, my uncle, who had been trained to be an air raid warden, got very worried because he thought war was about to happen. So he got some tape, and he taped up all the windows in the living room. And he and my brother were busy putting up the tape. At 11 o'clock, our 2 families gather in the living room to hear an announcement by the Prime Minister. And this is what we heard. Oops. Where's Dan? Well, it looks as though we're not going to hear it. Thank you.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done and that would have been more successful. Up to forward reasonable proposals which were rejected by the Poles, that is not a true statement. The proposals were never shown to the Poles, nor to us, and though they were announced in the German broadcast on Thursday night, Hitler did not wait to hear comments on them, but ordered his troops to cross the Polish frontier the next morning. His action shows convincingly that there is no chance of expecting that this man will ever give up his practice of using force to gain his will. He can only be stopped by force. And we in France are today, in fulfillment of our obligations, going to the aid of Poland, who is so bravely resisting this wicked and unprovoked attack upon her people. We have a clear conscience. We have done all that any country could do to establish peace. But a situation in which no word given by Germany's ruler could be trusted, and no people or country could feel itself safe, had become intolerable. And now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part with calmness and courage.
Immediately he stopped. The air raid sirens went. It was the first time we'd ever heard them. It was quite terrifying, and my uncle was delighted that he had put tape on the windows, expecting there would be a gas attack. But of course there was no attack, actually. I don't know whether it was set up that there would be just to make people realize they were at war or what, but the all clear went quite quickly, and we went on with our lives. The first months of the war, children were evacuated from central London. Now, we were living in Mill Hill, which is a suburb of London, but my school evacuated to Gloucestershire, which is in the west of the country. So if you go south, you're going towards France, and if you go west, you're going away towards Ireland, and it's a safer area to be. So they sent us to Gloucestershire, and my parents wrote to me to ask me whether I was happy. I'd only just arrived there, and I wasn't a bit happy. And so I said to them, no, I was not happy. And so they came in the car, and they fetched me, and I came home. But they were very worried because they did not want me to start being in London. And so they sent me to another school, and this time they thought, well, it'll be nearer home, so we'll send you to the south, to the coast in the south, which faced France. But since France was the ally of Britain, and France and Britain were now at war with Germany, they sent me to the school in the south, right on the coast, which turned out to be, you see, a big mistake, because the Germans invaded France, and then it became very dangerous to be in the south, but that's a few months later. I had a nice time at that school. I can remember being outside, and we were drawing a horse that was in a field, which was a little way from us, and I was leaning over drawing, and the horse started eating my hair. My hair was much more sort of, wild when I was little. And I was bending down, and all of a sudden there was this pulling on my hair. And everybody was laughing round about, and I wasn't, because it was hurting. So that was my experience, that one experience of the school. The other experience I'll tell you in a minute or two. In the spring of 1940, so over the winter, nothing very much happened as far as Britain was concerned in terms of the disturbances that affected the people on the ground. On May the 10th, Neville Chamberlain's replaced by Winston Churchill. By this time, the Germans have paid attention to Poland, they've defeated Poland, they're facing east, they've got an arrangement with Russia that Russia's not going to interfere. There's a sort of a dynamic there. They're not going to attack them. Okay, we won't attack you. So then they're safe on the eastern side. Now they're turning their attention west. And in the spring, there's a huge push by the German army to do, first of all, to swallow up the states that are very close by them on the west. They go into Denmark, then they go north into Norway, then they go west to Holland, and then they go into Belgium, and they're going very fast because they've got motorized vehicles which can go fast and really overthrew the countries in a sense, really terrifying everybody. By the time it came to May the 10th, when Neville Chamberlain is replaced by Winston Churchill, there's a crisis in Britain because it's clear that the Germans are going to be going much faster and they're attacking France. And France is, of course, the very strong ally of Britain, and there had been a thought that you might have been able to use the Maginot Line, which used to be the trenches from the First World War. Maybe you'd be able to stop the Germans because you'd still got the Maginot Line in place. But it was no good because the motorized vehicles went a completely different way through Belgium and Holland. So, in May and June, the German army invades and takes over Belgium and Holland and then France. And the British troops are pulled back with the French until they come right up to the coast, facing Britain. Does anybody know how far the distance is between England and France, between Calais and Dover?
22.
Yes, something between 20 and 26 miles. So it's very close, and you're very, very dangerous. So by the time it comes to 26th of May, the British troops are evacuated from France at the beaches of Dunkirk. Did anybody see the film of Dunkirk? Okay. So you've got a feel for what it was like in Dunkirk, or at least maybe some feel about it. So the British troops are there, and at some point then my mother comes by train to take me home from school. I get a message that she's coming, and I think the school may have sent a message to her to say, would you please come, we're closing the school down. But I don't know the details of that. But I do know we expected her, and I slept in a dormitory in the school, and we knew that it was going to be the last day, so we decided to have a feast. Well, how do you have a feast in a boarding school? What happened was you take some of the food, like maybe some bread, from what you have for supper. And then, if you're lucky, as we were, we had day pupils there, as well as the people who were staying in the school. And so you could get them to bring things into the school if you gave them some money to buy them. And we gave one of our friends some money to buy a can of sardines. And so we went to bed at night, and the light was off, and some of us had torches, which we could sort of use. And we very carefully opened the can of sardines. But then, of course, we had to share the sardines. And we were lying in bed but we had handkerchiefs, and in those days you didn't have paper handkerchiefs, you had cotton handkerchiefs. And so my daughter is laughing at the very story. So we each had a handkerchief. And so I took my handkerchief to get the sardine. So I put the sardine in my handkerchief, and then I went back to bed and ate the sardine. And then I put the handkerchief, you kept handkerchiefs, you didn't throw them away. So I put it in my pocket, or I picked it up from under the bed and put it in my pocket the next morning. And my mother came to fetch me, to take me home by train. But then that was interesting. So we're in the train, and my mother says, awful smell. And she says, do you have anything like fish on you? And I said, well, I don't know, but I got this handkerchief. And she took one look at it. She was just furious. And the train in those days would have a window down, and she just took it and threw it out of the window. So I was very distressed about that, because I didn't think it was a good idea to leave a handkerchief somewhere where the train had been. But we got rid of the smell. But then the other thing about that train ride was, when we got to the stations, there was no sign on the station to say what station it was. Because already, just at that time of Dunkirk, the rule had been made. By the way, this is the retreat from Dunkirk. These men lying down here, I thought at first that they might be bodies, but I think they're not. They actually are men lying down, because if they're standing up, they're going to be shot at as those, as those people seem to be in the distance there, if you can see it. So I think that's why they were lying down. Though some of them may have been hurt already, killed. But they thought they were only going to get 40,000 men off that beach. They actually got, I think it's 300,000 in the end, in a period of 10 days. It was quite amazing. But at the Battle of Britain, so now you're at a point where all the troops that they could have been brought home, but there's no France where they can be fighting, so they're going to be fighting to save Britain. All the beaches along the east coast are mined, so you cannot go down to the beach anywhere. Britain prepares for the German invasion. Church bells may be rung only to signal an invasion. Nighttime blackout is stringently enforced, and all road signs and station signs are taken down or painted over, just so that if a German parachutist lands, they were not going to have an easy time of finding their way. So this is a very interesting map. I don't know how many of you like maps, but I love them. But this is a German plan for the invasion of Britain. It was not a map that you could get at the time. I got it from a German history of the war. But it's interesting to me. Here's Calais and Boulogne, and over here you'd have Dunkirk. And you have all the possibility of the troops landing in Britain along here. This is Britain. I was about around there, I think, at school. And they were going to plan to just land in this part and then move to be up this next area and then get a group of attackers to attack round London and encircle London and then move out. And the thing that you should know, I'm going to give you the names of some things. This is called the Wash, and this is the Severn, the valley of the Severn River. And that line from the Wash to the Severn becomes important later on in the war because certain of the bombs that the Germans had could only reach that far. Coventry was in the area of the Midlands, which was very central to Britain for developing the fighters. All the building of the munitions and things went on in this central area where the Pennines are, and up into the north as far as Newcastle and going towards Scotland. So this was an area that was very important to keep out of the reach of the Germans. Because if the Germans were to attack the area where the weapons were being made, it would be almost impossible to defend the country. We were living further in the Northolt airport, but near an aerodrome called Hendon. And Hendon had a group of fighters that went up from it. They were called Hurricanes. There were two kinds of fighters, Hurricanes and Spitfires. Okay, the German raids on Britain begin at the end of August. So, late August 1940, the raids begin on London. Our family stays in the shelter for a few nights. The neighbour had a shelter. But then it was very uncomfortable there, and it wasn't clear that we really liked it enough that we would stay. So we didn't. We didn't stay. We went back next door to our house. My father left on the 24th of August 1940 by boat to the United States to sell leather. The only way the British could get enough dollars to be able to get from the United States the armaments they needed, because the United States was neutral, meant that you had to be able to sell something in exchange. And so a lot of businessmen were sent off to go to the United States. And I'll talk about that a little while. But just late in August, before Dad leaves, the Germans begin their raids on London. So our family then stayed there, and then Dad left. Then bombing daily began on the 7th of September in 1940. This is St. Paul's Cathedral, and here's the fires all around them. My grandmother and one aunt and uncle come from the central London to live in our house while Dad's away. Grandma and my aunt sleep in a bed upstairs. In the dining room are mattresses laid on the floors. My brother, who sleeps under the dining room table. My uncle against an inside wall. That's the uncle who shouts at the dog. And in the living room, my mother sleeps on the sofa and I sleep on a mattress on the floor near to her. We sleep this way every night from September, October, and early November, when Dad's away. Our dog, Timbo, is by our side throughout the bombing, and he was terrified of the gunfire, because as well as the bombers going over, there was a lot of gunfire for each one. One bad day was the 13th of September when the bombs hit Buckingham Palace, Downing Street, and other government buildings. The government insisted that the royal family, or maybe the royal family insisted, they would stay in London. And I just want to say that was terribly important for us, because the fact that the King and the Queen were there walking on the rubble was most important. My friends and I regularly collected shrapnel. What my father was seeing while he was in America was these awful stories about what was going on. A night of air terror, Lords also hit, and you can imagine what he must have felt while he was there, knowing that we were in London. But I want particularly to show you what he went through, and to show you this map, because by showing you that there's Germany here, Poland was there, the Germans were safe on the eastern side now because they got an agreement with Russia. They conquered Poland, and now they could turn their attention to Denmark and Norway. Well, why would they go and bother to go attack that way? Well, if they did that, then they could get those ports along there, and they would have access to a lot of sea things without having to do it. The Germany didn't have an access to the Atlantic except through the English Channel, and the English had a very strong fleet. So if they conquered Norway, Denmark and Norway, they could get into the North Sea, and then they could send their U-boats. This is the line of the U-boats would go. And then they have south of France and Spain. Spain, having been at war, was now neutral, but it was Franco, the ruler, was in cahoots with Germany in the sense that they were able to provide assistance when needed. Portugal's here, Gibraltar is here, and Italy is here, of course. So the British were dependent on food coming in part from, in part some fresh fruit like oranges and bananas and things came in the Mediterranean through Gibraltar, through the Straits of Gibraltar and up to Britain, or they came from the United States to Britain. And so what the Germans did was they had ports here that they could use, and they sent the U-boats out, and that's the line of the U-boats, right? So here are the people who are going to go from Britain to America, and here is the line where the convoys came. The British, through their navy, arranged that the convoys would be here, and they would escort some of the ships into and out of Britain, so that there would be some security for them to go and keep up trade, because otherwise the British would not be able to survive. My father took a boat from Liverpool, actually, and went on this route. And he told us that the boat that he was on was filled with women and children, because the British agreed that lots of them would be sent to Canada if there were relatives in Canada who'd take them, or to America. And so my father told us that when they were on that boat, they had daily lifeboat drills, and the men knew that they were not going to survive because there were not, if they were hit, because there were not enough boats for them and for the women and children. My father went to America and arrived in Boston, and then he would go down to New York to sell leather, and he would also later be up in Montreal. But he was safe and went. He was waiting for his samples of leather to come later because they couldn't all get on the boat together. The next boat that came over was the city of Benares, which you may have heard of. The city of Benares was filled with women and children, and it was attacked by the Germans somewhere along this route in this area where they were, and the boat was sunk, and all his goods got put into the water and could not be used, and he had lengthened the stay that he had to get there. So those are the government, after the city of Benares was sunk, a government-sponsored program to evacuate children to Canada and the USA was stopped. All letters that came from abroad or were going abroad were opened and examined during the war. So you knew that everything was going to be looked at. And from his letters, Dad was very careful how he wrote so that he was able to put down. He sort of said, well, we gathered from what he wrote that Dad planned to catch a boat from Quebec or Montreal, and that November the 10th was the very last day that we should expect him to arrive home in England. And the night came on November the 10th with no word of his arrival. I remember this night very vividly. My mother was on the sofa crying, and I'm standing behind her saying to her, you know, don't cry, it's all right, Ronnie and I will look after you. As though that would have been enough for her, but it was what the only thing that we could do. And so it was a terrifying experience. And at 2 o'clock, the front doorbell rings, and Dad's at the door. And he tells us he'd telegraphed us from Liverpool. And next morning, he answers the doorbell, and it's the telegraph boy with the telegram. So he was home safely. But he was horrified by what he found out about what was going on, and he decided that my mother and I, maybe my brother, but I can't remember my brother being with us, we needed a vacation. And so he decided that he needed to go up to the Midlands where the factory was of the firm that he was selling leather for, or he gained his leather from them. And they were in Rushden. Rushden is 20 miles from Coventry. He arrived back home on the 10th of November. We had a day or so, I guess, when he was resting, and we set out on the way to Rushden. We stayed the night in Rushden, and when we got there, the sirens went. And when the sirens went, we could hear the German bombers. Now, the German bombers changed their engines in some way, so they would go, It wasn't just an airplane that was going straight. It was this constant, and they're going overhead, and you knew they weren't very low, they were a long way up, and they were going, and they were going, and then they stopped, and then we went to bed, and then the sirens went again, and there was this overhead, and you knew that somewhere nearby it was being bombed. And that was the night the Germans wiped out the center of Coventry. And that was the first time that they attacked where the munitions and the stuff for the military was being made. And they absolutely destroyed the center of the city. And you can see that's the cathedral as it was. And the important thing, and I think this was very important, either the government decided that the royal family needed to come immediately to Coventry to raise the spirits of the people, because in fact the attack on Coventry could have so demoralized people that they could have started the movement to say, we've got to give in, we can't go on. But I think that having the royal family there, it sounds strange to people in this country, but to my mind it was a very important point. The king and the queen would go out, and you see she's wearing these fancy shoes. I don't know how she did it, but she was always walking in rubble, wherever it was, in London or wherever it was. But that's the day after the bombing that they went to Coventry. And we pulled through from there, and it was a good thing that it didn't come till November, because by November the whole country had recovered somewhat from the terrible disasters at Dunkirk in June. Now, I wanted to show you, as I said, I love maps, and so this is a map of where I lived. That's my house on Parkside. It's the hill here from Watford Way is quite steep, and this area here is sort of sloping down. So this area with the Hendon Aerodrome is flat and is much lower than we were. And what happened was these things are where bombs actually dropped. And I was trying to think, if I was at Capitol Lakes, where would this be in relation to Capitol Lakes? Buns Lane would be, I guess, around where the Capitol is, I think. And then this up here, Wise Lane and Page Street, is probably a little bit further. But it's all very close. And that was an unexploded bomb. This one went off. This one went off. There's a park here where we used to go. And then this here is an area of low-cost housing. But where the aerodrome was, I guess it was a low land, and they put a lot of housing in this area. And one day, when I was asleep on my parents' bedroom facing this whole area, a plane came over. If it was cloudy, it was very difficult to spot the planes, and the plane came over and just dropped a bomb, but dropped it there in the middle of the housing estate and killed quite a few people. But that was the closest a big bombing came. The aerodrome was the home for the hurricane fighters, and so it was a busy place and important. Okay, what was daily life like? Have I gone on too long? What's the time? Oops. All right. You see, we had food rationing. If you were Jewish, you could get substitute cheese for bacon, and if you were Muslim, you could. Eggs were scarce. Eggs were scarce, but we did have hens around, so you could get eggs. Oranges and grapefruit and bananas were kept for children or for seniors when they were available, but they were only available if the boats got to get through. Gasoline was rationed, and it was very stringent, and after 1942, only cars with business permits were allowed on the roads. So we had that. Family contributions to the war effort. By the war's end, 9 of my first cousins, 5 men and 4 women, had served or were still serving. One cousin, Jim Jacobs, was a radio operator on a Wellington bomber, was killed in 1941. I was 12. As his plane crash landed, returning from a mission, he got out to see what was wrong and walked into the propeller that was still going round. This is Jim, and this is his brother John. And years later, my brother found out from John that he had been waiting on leave from the Navy and was waiting at the airport to have dinner with Jim when he never came home because of the bombing. Early in 1944, Ronnie, my brother, was conscripted into the coal mines. Now, at the beginning of the war, a lot of people in the coal mines enrolled for the Army or the Navy or the Air Force. You wanted to be up and not in coal mines if you could manage it. So a lot of the coal mines didn't have enough people in there, and you needed the coal to be able to manufacture things. And so there was conscription for the coal mines. But the way it was done was there was a lottery, and my brother got pulled out from the lottery, and he was very upset. He wanted my father to try and get him into the Navy, but my father said, can't do it. And my grandfather wrote to my brother and said, do not try that, because you may have won the lottery for life. And so my brother went into the coal mines for 2 years, and some conscientious objectors also served in the coal mines. 4 of my uncles served in the army. One, as I told you before, was part of the Battle of El Alamein. Another was a civil engineer at the War Office on construction and maintenance of arms factories. I attended a state-run school. We knitted balaclavas for the troops. There's balaclava. We gave money at school from our allowance to buy national savings stamps. And when I was home, I tended our vegetable garden. And I took a Red Cross first aid course on giving tourniquets and doing everything if there was a bombing. At one board, well, that time I can tell you about, but it's not significant. I left boarding school and went home. At Judaism, we didn't live near a synagogue, so we just kept things at home. We shopped monthly at a kosher grocer. When not at boarding school, I had Hebrew lessons at home with a teacher who came from Czechoslovakia. I was much more interested in having her talk to me about Czechoslovakia than I was in learning Hebrew. So I used to egg her on until I found out an awful lot about what her pre-war life was like and didn't learn very much of Hebrew. I learned a lot about her. I loved poetry. Those are some things that I brought here with me to Capitol Lakes. That bookcase I have here with me, I grew up with it. In 1942, the Allied forces defeat Germany in North Africa. Our dog Timbo died, and Ronnie chose Vicky for us. He called him Victory, but we called him Vicky for short. Here's Vicky. He was very, very lovely dog. Two Americans, very important in my life, both working for the American intelligence in Britain. Mooney Harding, Francis Appleton Harding III was a member of the Massachusetts legislature later on. He was a Harvard graduate. He taught my parents, who were people had left school. My mother left school at 16, my father at 14, to go to the family business. Neither of them felt that arguing was a good thing. They always said to me, "Don't argue. You don't argue." And any discussion was an argument, and they got upset about it. And Mooney and Ed taught me that it was fine for me to argue, as I always did about everything. And they put me on the road, I think, to become an academic. Okay. Remember them? Cliffs of Dover, tomorrow.
Just you wait and see. There'll be love and
Laughter and peace ever after. Tomorrow, when
the world is free. The shepherd will tend his sheep. The valley will bloom again. And Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see.
Well, so interesting. I hadn't ever thought of this before until I started putting this on there. Why does she say the valley will bloom again? What does that mean? And what does it mean to say the shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again? Anybody got any links anywhere else?
Peace. Silent peace. It would be the silent peace.
The silent
Of peace.
of peace, yes. But I think that links up to the 21st Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Makes me to walk in green pastures. He leads me You have the valley, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. Well, the valley is green again. It's very, very interesting. I hadn't thought about this before, but also it gives you an idea of what peace is going to be. It's going to be a war to end all wars. I thought it was going to be a war to end all wars. That was what I was told. So when I heard that song, it meant something very much to me. And we're going to go further. I wrote a poem, the first poem which I had written that I got a prize for. I got a book from it, writing it. I'm going to read it to you because I want to do so because between that time at the beginning of 1944 and 1945, when peace came, my idea as to what peace would be had been shattered. And what happened was an enormous depression that I went through in the years following. We've passed through the night, the time of despair, and now comes the sunrise, the morning is here. Away with the blackout, we've beaten the Hun. That was how we referred to the Germans in those days. Turn all the lights up, for victory's come. There are cream buns and donuts and fresh fruits galore, and men selling onions come round to the door. Now there are no sirens, our nights are all quiet, and no MP worries about our food diet. But I love to walk past the street lamps at night, to see our old London a-twinkling with light, and the people all singing and dancing with fun. For the whole world is shouting, a new life's begun. That was my vision as a child, until 1944. Okay, so this is it, my answers to the questions for 1944-45. How did my ideas change? What did I experience, and what effect during the war did my being Jewish have upon me? Okay, the direct effects of the war that I experienced were flying bombs and long-distance rockets. The Germans developed flying bombs that we call doodlebugs. They're forerunners of today's cruise missiles. And also the Germans developed long-distance rockets. Variants of both weapons have become a regular part of modern warfare since World War II. This is my diary. I was 15, and I wrote this on the night of the 23rd of June, 1944. And I'm going to show you some in my own handwriting in a minute, but I'll read this out so for those of you who can't see. On the night of Thursday last, June the 15th, 1944, the Germans began sending pilotless aircraft or flying bombs over southern England. This southern part of England is south of a line drawn from the Wash to the Severn. Remember, I showed you that line on the map. These bombs are sent from the coast of France, especially the Pas-de-Calais area, and have a range of 150 miles. I think they're mainly directed against the London area. At first, the anti-aircraft guns went into action, but they're not accurate enough as the bomb flies on a straight course, so fighters have been potting at them. They are familiarly known as doodlebugs. And here's my understatement, which you'll see it was extraordinarily frightening for me, and my writing later on gets very erratic. They're quite frightening and do the same amount of damage as a 2,000-pound bomb. I was very scared at the beginning. You hear them come over rather like an ordinary plane, but jet-propelled, and then suddenly the engine stops, and after 3 or 10 seconds an explosion is heard, sometimes very near. And this paragraph is followed by something very odd, and I'm going to read out to you what it says. But I was so frightened about what it was, and I was frightened of saying how frightened I was. So even in my diary, I was frightened to write it, and so I chose writing it in a language that I made up. And those of you who are good at looking at made-up languages will be able to see how I did it. We have been in the shelters nearly all day for the last week. We start exams on Tuesday, And if the siren goes while the exam is on, we have to go to the shelters on our honor not to talk. I wonder if we will. These flying bombs have certainly livened things up a bit, perhaps a bit too much. So, the thing I want to point out to you is that the teachers, the shelters were at school. When we went down into a shelter, it was a very long tunnel, and it had benches in the middle, and two classes sat back to back. So we would be sitting lengthwise in the shelter, and I would be facing this way, and all my class would be facing this way, and you would be facing this way all the way along. And the teachers would continue teaching. The teachers had to keep us teaching. They were also giving us exams. And they weren't going to let up on this, I think, because to keep us sane at that moment and keep themselves sane, they had to keep us going. My mother, on the other hand, was at home by herself with the dog. And there was 7 sirens? I don't know, later on. There were 7 sirens in one day. So you can imagine she didn't have a shelter. She had a dog with her.
Diary for June the 20th.
Well, sorry, I guess I did it. Okay, this is the next one. My diary from July the 6th, 1944, 10:28 p.m. Ronnie went to Sheffield on Monday, June the 27th, and is getting on okay. The Russians have captured Minsk and Polotsk and are driving on for Vilna. Their summer offensive only began on June the 22nd, just 3 years after the Germans attacked Russia. Americans from Cherbourg are on the offensive, and it can now be said that the weather in June from the 6th to the 30th was the worst for 16 years. Just before the attack on Cherbourg, a great crisis arose through lack of ammunition, and it took great courage to keep the front in Normandy. In Italy, Siena was captured a few days ago. Mr. Churchill spoke in the House of Commons today about the flying bombs. He said that so far 5,754 have been launched from the hurriedly prepared platforms in France. 5,752 people have been fatally injured and about 8,000 injured. The first platforms were destroyed by our bombers, but these, the latest ones, are prefabricated and easily produced. It would be a lengthy business, and people were not being discouraged from leaving London, said the Prime Minister. Deep shelters are to be reopened. Blast has been considerable. It is quite a serious attack directed against London. We have finished the exams. Now for the results. I was away today because Mummy thought I'd had enough of the shelters for a few days. I shall go tomorrow for geography results, and so, being as it's 10:45, I had better close down and get some sleep in, especially as the doodlebugs might come again. So I thought that was interesting for you to see both how my handwriting had sort of disintegrated, and you'll see from a later bit that I have also from my diary how different my handwriting was. By the time it came to that point, my mother was so distraught. My father decided we had better leave London, just as Churchill had suggested, which they were opening the bomb shelters in the tubes, in the subways. And so we left for a few days. We went for 2 weeks, back down to where we had been, where I was at school earlier. And of course we didn't think very much about that because of course the doodlebugs were being sent to London, so they had a much longer trajectory. What we didn't bargain for was that they weren't all good, and some of them fell in the wrong place. And we hadn't been back in Angmering for more than a day or two when a doodlebug actually dropped very close to us where we were. And my mother at that point decided, well, maybe we shouldn't stay down there very long. We'll go back home. And at least she would then be able to be with Dad while he was still in London. He, by the way, was working in an area of London which rockets could reach. And that was an even more terrifying thing than the doodlebugs, because the doodlebugs you could hear approaching. A rocket, the thing about the rockets and why they were so extraordinarily when they were new, was that the radar couldn't catch them, and they went up high and then they came down. And at that point you hadn't got the opportunity even to have the sirens go. So parts of the south of London were really bombed very heavily by the rockets in 1944. And you could argue, I suppose, that if it hadn't been for the fact that the Allies were now moving through France and into Germany itself, that and they were able to go very close and bomb the Peenemünde area where the doodlebugs and the rockets were being made, and at the same time then destroy the factories, that had it been earlier in the war, we might have been in a much greater problem for being able to sustain the society as we did. Okay. I'm not going to spend very long on this, but one of the most important things in 44-45 was the opening of Buchenwald and the other concentration camps. And for me, that was an enormous trauma. And I had a note on my rough notebook. We always had rough notebooks that we wrote things in every day. And I would put, "Don't forget Buchenwald" on it. And I always sat very much in the front of the class and put it so that people could see and the teacher could see. And whenever I got a new rough notebook, I put the sign on again, until one day the whole thing fell off from the weight of the number of rough notebook covers that it was attached to it. Here's a picture of what I saw of the Buchenwald survivors. And just so that you know, I think it's in this bunk here is Elie Wiesel. But these people, as you can see, were starved. And that was, the pictures from the concentration camps were just frightening. So the thing that happened to me was that I found myself asking, you know, who was I to have been saved from such horror? And why was it that Anne Frank died and I didn't? And what does it mean? And why did that happen to her and not to me? And could those who were found alive in the camps ever go home if they were Jewish? Their homes had been taken over by others. Where would they go? If not, where could they go? And I found myself really questioning all that all the time. What does the end of a war mean? So this is where you discover how the view of what it meant to have a war was. Since I last wrote, news beyond all belief has occurred. The war in Europe is over. We celebrated VE Day Tuesday, though the Germans were given till 1 minute after midnight on Tuesday to surrender. The war in the Far East is going well. And on Tuesday we went into London and saw the Prime Minister and many MPs. And we went to Buckingham Palace, but were unlucky in our choice of time, as the King and Queen, etc., had been out a little before. I then wrote to Churchill on Wednesday. I don't know why, save that I was determined to. May the 31st, that was May the 8th, May the 31st, Thursday. The news is quite disquieting. The French have landed reinforcements in Syria, and the Syrians and Lebanese have objected to their newly won freedom being violated. The French have bombarded and bombed Damascus. We have intervened and told the French to stop the fight. We seem to get one war finished and start another. To my surprise, I yesterday received an official answer to my letter to the Prime Minister. I'm very thrilled. Also, yesterday evening, Margaret and I went to a Labour meeting at John Keble Church Hall, and it was very interesting. Today we had our French oral. Well, my reading, I think, was okay, but my talking, etc., was not. I hope I've passed okay. Here's the letter I received from Churchill, Prime Minister, Miss Joan Jacobs, that was my name, my address, 41 Parkside, Mill Hill, 10 Downing Street, Whitehall. Very important to have the envelope, because my name from that is not on the letter. The letter says, I have been deeply touched by all the messages of goodwill which have reached me at this time. Thank you so much for your kind thought, Winston Churchill, May 1945. I have not been able at the moment to track the letter that I sent him. I wonder whether it was ever kept, because I think there must have been so many people writing at that time that it might well have been collected somewhere, and I need to go look for it. I have the letter with me here, capital X. So that's the end of that part of the story. But of course, in the months following, there were the big battle over issues with Japan. And then there was the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs by the Allies, or by the Americans, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then there was the dropping by 1946, in June 1940. Then there was an increase in tension between Russia, who would not get out of the Eastern European countries but wanted to have a collaboration between the communist governments in them all. And there was a problem of not giving up in China, the area around that Chiang Kai-shek wanted to re-establish his hold over the land that Japan had even come into in the north of China. And my depression became very, very great. And I wrote 3 poems in 1946 that I want to read to you. So the first one is called Summer After the Holocaust. And the Holocaust at this time was perceived to be the whole turmoil of the deaths that had taken place throughout the world. It wasn't merely, as it's become more usual to speak of the Holocaust as only being what happened to the Jews at that time in Europe, but also what happened to the millions of people who were killed in Russia and in Germany and in France and everywhere in the world. So, Summer After the Holocaust. The dross of mankind remains, the rest is dust. Here, where the soul still feigns its former lust, we stagger. Cleansed by our tears, our sorrow, the earth is fresh, the wheel of life rotates in peace, and fate's enchanting gifts refresh us. The present is our love. Tomorrow rests unspoken, limpid token of our fear. And then, on seeing a memorial service, a picture of a memorial service in Lidice in Czechoslovakia in 1946, picture of a mother and a daughter who had survived. The whole, I don't know if you know the story, but Lidice was a village, a small town in Czechoslovakia, and it was known that there was a German commandant there, and some people from the village went and killed him, and on the order of Hitler, the whole village was wiped out. And so this is a picture from the memorial service. A few people escaped, and one of them was this woman with a little girl who must have been 3 or 4. Life has fled, dead with her family, yet lifeless, she lived. They cried it to the heavens. She lives. A mother from Lidice lives. She lived. The words paralyzed their lips. They shuddered at her deathful countenance, bereft of fat, of warmth, of hope. Or was hope latent that day? For remnants gathered to pray for the dead, dead too become. The child echoed the mother, reflected, dejected, her mood. But the spirit alive feeds on hope, not the fuel of death. What of those left, O Lidice? And lastly, sitting in London in June the 30th at 10:40 at night, on 1946, listening to Operation Crossroads. Did any of you hear Operation Crossroads when the next iteration of the atomic bomb was dropped on Bikini Island? Bikini Island in the Pacific has never recovered, and some American admirals have said that it was one of the biggest disasters ever to happen. But it has never recovered, and it's very important for us to understand this, because we have bigger and better bombs now than we had then. By the time it came to this point, I was almost convinced that we were determined as a human species to wipe ourselves out. So this poem is called Before Operation Crossroads, 1946. For we have cried, lighten our darkness, and through the night, fearing, hearing on the air the agency of death, we listen to our fate. Snugly seated, pettily airing our ills, grills will flame blasting tidal waves, deflating life, bellying the air. Oh God, is this the light? The height is reached, for we have prayed, peace in our time, Lord. Might there not be peace with none to see? For death brings peace on earth, not hell to be. O God, make speed to save us. That's the end of my presentation. If any of you want to comment or have any questions, I'll take them. Thank you. Just to say, yes.
Just a comment. I was a year younger than you and also spent my childhood in London, and I remember at the beginning of the war, when we went to the pictures, the movies, we saw a reenactment of what to do if the Germans parachuted and invaded by a parachute. And what we were told to do was to let the air out of our bicycle tires, and this would help to halt the German invasion. It shows you how pathetic we were.
Maybe they thought if you took the air out of the tires, the Germans wouldn't be able to tear your bicycle away from you and pedal off to wherever they were going. Yes. Did I ever what? No, because... Did I ever see a Nazi? I did not see any armed people coming, no. I don't know whether any people who were around were Nazis. I doubt they were. There were a lot of people in Britain, at least before the war, who were what we call fascists. They were very right-wing, and they were prepared to follow the Nazi ideas. But I don't believe that we ever saw Nazis, no. Yes, somebody there.
There's a gentleman by the name of Sir Oswald Mosley.
Yes, Oswald Mosley was a fascist, yes.
Yes, who was, I don't know what he called his tiny little party. It was definitely a fascist Nazi. Yeah. But my question was this, that one of your poems referred to onion sellers.
Yes.
I have only read about them. I understand they're from Brittany.
They used to be from Spain, I think.
Spain?
I was just going to say that. I believe it was Spanish onion sellers who used to come round. They had the onions on long strings, and
yes.
They would put them on their neck.
And they wore berets.
Yeah.
On a bicycle.
You remember that too.
Joan, I was born the day that Hitler invaded Poland.
Oh my goodness.
No, I wasn't born that day. I was 5 years old. September 1st is my birthday.
Right.
September 3rd was my parents' 6th wedding anniversary.
Oh wow.
But I have very clear memories of the war and very different memories from yours. We had kids evacuated to us from London. Lived in a small town 120 miles from London. And I remember one of the evacuees scaring the hell out of me. She was a big girl, about 10 years old. And she told me that when you go to flush the toilet, which was a matter of pulling the chain, you better get away from there very quickly because the snakes will come out and bite you.
Anyone else got any memories to share? Somebody's there. Yes.
I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing some terrible years with us that you will never forget, I know. And we always say, lest we forget. And I think, unfortunately, in this day and age, it's repeated over and over again, lest we forget. It is very important to everyone and everyone of our children and grandchildren hearing this. And I can't thank you enough because I know this is something that is always going to be hurtful. But thank you for bringing it to us.
Thank you.
Here, here.
Thank you.